Welcome to the Postkahanism podcast. Today we'll be doing a book review with our guest, Dictator's Den, another book review. This episode's book is something unique. It's called Crossed with Crosses, and it's an autobiography by the Russian author Edward Kochergin. Kochergin had a very interesting life story. His parents were arrested when he was a toddler. His father was a researcher involved in, he calls it cybernetics, but it was really more like industrial engineering at this point in 1937. And apparently he was executed for his espionage. Kochergin's mother was Polish, and she was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison during the NKVD's mass arrests of Soviet Poles 2 years later. And Kochergin, who at this point was something like two, was sent to the NKVD's orphanage system. World War II started, and he was evacuated to Siberia. Eventually, he escaped from the orphanage and started making his way west back to Leningrad across the Soviet Union, hoping to find his mother. He would ride the rails during the warm part of the year and then turn himself in when it would get cold to escape again the following spring. The Soviet Union was broken down by regions, and the orphanage system was also regionalized. So as long as you made it to another region, you would not be returned to the one from which you escaped. So he could kind of ratchet his way year by year across the USSR. Along the way, he was inducted into the Soviet professional criminal class, whose members colloquially refer to themselves as those who've been crossed with crosses. And this was kind of a reference to the Via Dolorosa of their lives. And this is where the name of the book came from. And it's a wonderful book in several ways. First of all, it's a great road action novel, right? Like a road action story. Second, it's an incredible ethnographic and historical document, because the post-World War II Soviet Union was in the period of Volkswanderung. It was the product of 30 years of unbroken wars, revolution, civil war, dislocation. Millions of people who had been evacuated to the east were making their way back west, and millions who had served in the Soviet army in the west were coming back east, and they were all doing this on the rails, which was kind of the environment that he was moving through over a period of years. And so the book is a unique testimony of this wide cross section of this history from the perspective of a young boy growing up over the span of a decade. That's about how long it took him to get back to Leningrad. So let's get into it. Mr. Dictator's Dan, what did you think about the book?
Well, I'm glad you did the intro and you mentioned the cybernetics thing, because I read that and I was trying to see if there was a more unorthodox, because I think of cybernetics, I think of like Terminator 2 or something like that. And I apologize for my creaking computer chair. I hope that's not being picked up in the microphone.
No, it's fine.
But he says, he talks about his father who was arrested, and it's clear that it's sort of hazy. He just talks about how he would stare at the ceiling when he was a boy. That was his earliest memory. And he would look at the weird designs of the ceiling and he would just, kind of enjoy them. And he viewed it as like a maze or whatever. And then he talks about how his mother, like his Polish ancestor, and I guess he remembers being, the Poles are Catholics, I think.
Yes,
If you look at John Paul II, and the Russians, are Orthodox. So that creates problems later in the book. But he talks about his early, I guess, baptism. But when he goes to the orphanage, one of the things that I remember was this scene where they're in an airplane. And you think that the NKVD prisoners, normally when you think about whether it's the Third Reich or Stalin or Mao or whatever, you think these people are transported by just very gross freight trains, or they're put in the cargo hold of a ship. But they were in a plane, and there's a scene where this plane is flying and it gets shot down, and the kids, these orphans who are I guess they're political prisoners in a way. They're in these orphanage, but I think he talks about them being
Hmm.
tied with ropes
Well, they didn't
to
have
the
seatbelts.
yeah,
They
they
didn't
tied
have
them with
seatbelts.
ropes. Imagine tying like a little like toddler or a preschooler or a kindergartner with ropes. I think this book covers when he's 6 to 12. They tied
No,
it.
no.
It reminds me that. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
At this point, I think this is 1941, right? So for a little
But
bit of context, Leningrad had been surrounded by the Germans and the
yes,
Finns, and
that's an
was
awful
blockaded for several
siege.
years. Right.
That's
There
a
was
cannibalism. I think like almost 1 million people died. Like it's just
right,
yeah,
and so
really
he
repulsive
somehow
book.
through God's intervention he got evacuated first by truck, and they got strafed by German planes apparently.
Yeah,
Um, and then and people were wounded and killed and whatever in the truck, and then by plane, and so by cargo plane,
yeah.
right, and so
They tied him down in the hold. It's like that Ben-Hur
well,
scene where the
it's like
slaves on the galley
no,
where they
no,
were
no,
chained
no, no.
together.
This isn't
Okay,
this isn't how I understood it. It wasn't that they
okay,
were
go ahead.
tied up so that they wouldn't get away. They were in the cargo compartment of a C-47, I guess, or an
Yeah,
LI-2 is what the Russian version was called, and they would just tie them in like if you're in a military cargo plane today, you get basically you strap yourself in with seatbelts. Well,
yeah.
these guys didn't have seatbelts, so they had some kind of rope. And I'm sure they didn't have like baby seats for these little toddlers and little kids either. So they just tied them in with the rope, and their plane got shot down. And they had to survive in the snow for several days, and eventually
And
got evacuated to Kuibyshev, right, Samara.
okay. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
no, I wasn't saying they were because there's not like they could escape on the plane. It reminds me like just the idea. And yes, it was just a seatbelt, but just the idea of just taking rope and putting them in the cargo
sure,
hold.
sure.
It's like you think of these movies you've seen, like the '80s action movies or like Navy SEALs, that movie where there's all these like jeeps in the cargo hold that are strapped down, and the idea like, okay, we got some kindergartners. All right, let's get the rope and we'll tie it around, then we'll strap them down. But he it was a pretty horrific thing. Like he talks about like one of the people, I think there was a gunner or something who
Yeah,
got
right,
shot in
right.
the head,
Got
and
killed. Yeah,
they crashed. I think they crashed on a frozen lake. I'm not sure, but they
right.
got out and they managed to get. And I'm glad. Like I'm going to be mispronouncing these Russian names. He was in I think at least 3, possibly 4 orphanages, and these were like orphanages on different parts of Russia. He was in one in the Urals, but he eventually gets there, and there is a book, or it's a series of fantasy books by this guy Mervyn Peake. It's called the Gorman Gas trilogy, and it's really wonderful. If you like it, if you've read like the Tolkien books, the Gorman Gas stuff is a lot like that, and it's sort of like about the contrast between modernity and tradition. It's just beautiful books. But the reason I'm bringing them up is because when he went to this orphanage, there's a strange society that just is emergent. Like the older kids boss the younger kids around, and there's different like you know it's a kind of a brutal system, and they're not nice to each other. They haze one another. But all the adults that live there was a Greek guy who was Russian, and I think they called him
Themis.
Themis. Yeah, Themis. But there was like
Themistocles.
there was this woman who ran it who was called Toad, and she was a great painter though, and she was just this mean old bitch. And there was just this pockmarked person. Like all the people are physically ugly, like all the guards, and he describes them as cowards who they were sent there. They couldn't hack it on the front. I don't know if that's true, but and if you read the Gorman Gas trilogy, there's a cook named Swelter who was just this big bloated bully, and there was this guy named Flay who is just sort of the caretaker of Tight. Like really beautiful books.
Sorry,
But when I was reading his memoir, it almost had.
you're breaking up a little bit. A second.
Oh, where did I break up? I'm sorry. Can you hear
No,
me
no.
now?
You're reading the yeah. I can hear you now. Yeah. So these books, you have these like kind of cartoonish characters
Yeah,
who are large. Well, I mean, you gotta also look at it this way. This guy was a
he
little
was
kid,
6.
right?
Yeah.
And
No,
he lands in this like phantasmagorical world where it's a prison for little kids, sort of. And
yeah,
these people
and
running it,
it's
they're kind of like they're kind of cartoon characters a little bit, right?
yeah.
and when you think about like how they got to where they were, these people were the product of, I mean, they were maybe in their 20s, their 30s. So they were little kids when the revolution, the Civil War happened, and they were the products of broken homes and total dislocation too. A lot of these guys.
Yeah.
So they were not like, but he has these incredible, his Kochergin as an adult spent his entire career as a painter for a theater, painting backdrops and things like this.
Oh,
And
wow. I didn't
so
know that.
he
Is
was
there a follow-up memoir after this one that you like that's available?
there's a collection of his stories, which are from Leningrad once he gets back, which is like 1950s Leningrad and the underworld that
And
he
just
sort of lived in.
And I
Right?
know that most of the people listening to this, but just to be clear, okay, Leningrad is now
St.
it
Petersburg.
was St. Petersburg. It is as far west as Russia. It's near Finland. So for perspective and just to give a size of how big, and he runs into all kinds of different nationalities, but he was in orphanages in the Urals, the Ural mountain range. I mean, he was in Siberia far out. So he traveled across, and I want to give perspective. Like he literally traveled the globe from like he had to get from one part of this huge country. I don't know how many time zones Russia is, but he had to get eventually across all the way to basically the edge of Western Europe. But that just gives you a scope of like how wide his travels were. And if you look at a map of Russia, that is quite an astounding thing, especially when you consider that, again, this took place, I think, between his ages of 6 and 12. Like he traveled more than probably most adults travel, and he did it as
16, I believe.
What's that?
Yeah, 6 and 16, I think.
Oh, okay. It's an astounding like journey.
Huge.
Like, I mean, yeah,
Well,
it's a huge country.
Right. And of course, he was doing all this, illegal. So, but I want to get back a little bit to the first orphanage that he's writing about.
Yeah.
So he has these guards slash, the administrative staff, and he has two people who are very sympathetic. One of whom is a cook who has
Famous.
Well, no, Themis was kind of the janitor there, who's apparently he was a Pontic Greek.
Yeah. And they asked him
from the Black Sea area. Yeah.
Well, so I talked about again, just the comparisons between these weird looking staff members and the Gorman Gas fantasy stuff, because it does read like fantasy, and I mean that in the best way. But the older kids, I think at first they thought he was a stammerer or something because he was Polish. They don't like these. The Russian Empire is just full of these nationalities. Like there's so many different types of people. I mean, if you look at like the Kalmyks, like there are some Russians that look like Europeans, and there are some that look Asian. I mean, even Lenin to me looks kind of interesting. Like it's just there's so many people living here. But I think he spoke Polish and he didn't speak much and he stuttered, and they were like just giving him a hard time, but eventually he started to speak Russian. Maybe this is before that, but
he said it took him 2 years to start speaking.
Yeah,
Russian.
but they were impressed. Like he is a very smart, it's sort of like in our Forsaken episode where we talked about like these people who were just shrewd. They were either like tough or they were good at drawing
Victor
stuff.
Herman.
Yeah,
Right.
Victor Herman or Thomas Segovia. Like they were just good at artists or they had some gift, and he eventually gained the respect. But they would find cockroaches and they would take like a straw or something and they would catch these cockroaches and they would just like blow them like a blowgun into the toad, the head master's, the woman who did the paintings, her office, because they didn't like her. She was really nasty. And he made like a wire sculpture of, I think Lenin and Stalin.
Well, right. So this kind of gets into it a little bit later. So he taught himself how to draw cards.
Yeah, that saved him so many times.
And so he gained diplomatic immunity because everybody likes playing cards, but cards are absolutely contraband. And these kids are sitting there and they're hungry, like they're mostly eating. Like I guess boiled grains from what I remember, and they would get bread and butter on Soviet holidays and on Stalin's birthday.
And they made ice cream using their teeth, like they scraped the butter. It's disgusting. They made ice cream using bread mush that they chewed, and they took like sugar and butter, and they just made this ice cream, and they all shared it. But
because they didn't know what ice cream was.
Yeah, they just were like, it must have this in it, and it's again though you cannot help but kind of admire the ingenuity because these are like young people. They have nothing. They're on like they're just completely desperate, but they their innate like skills arise just out of the sheer desperation of the situation they're in, and they are very like quick on their like they can think of stuff like this. They can come up with like this ingenious, he could paint cards. He could take scrap wire and just fold it into like a profile picture of Stalin and Lenin. And I'm not trying to jump ahead. But
right.
The cockroach.
This was,
oh, go ahead.
Sorry. So this proved huge, right? This proved huge in his fate, right? Making like folding copper wire into like recognizable profiles of, because Stalin and Lenin were the two big Soviet icons.
They were everywhere.
They were everywhere. So eventually he escapes this thing, right, with his friend, and they escape.
Mitya. Or no, it was Peter. It was Peter first. And I want to talk about Peter.
Yes. Go ahead, please.
Well, no, I just meant to say that, and he meets Mitya later. Mitya, all of his traveling companions have these horrible fates. And I want to talk about Peter for 1 second, where they ride the rails. I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm sorry. This is just something I would like if you could have more context on it.
Sure.
But there's a scene. Oh, go ahead.
So this is they escape in 1945, in the summer of 1945, after Germany's been defeated.
Yes.
And the Soviets are flexing to the east. They're going to attack the Japanese, who until then they'd had a peace treaty with. And him and his buddy escape, and his buddy's kind of a little kind of a fatso. Well, I mean, I guess they don't have enough food to be fatsos, but if he had enough food, he relative to him. And they escape, and they get to the rail yard. Yes. And they jump onto a train full of soldiers, but these aren't regular soldiers. These soldiers,
are like the convicts. These are the convicts we were talking about. Suvorov, like the Gulag. Some of these Gulag people did fight, and there were some hardened men that fought and were used as soldiers, but they were previously in like Gulags, and there was a lot of that. And these were the kind of men that they were. Would you describe these men as we talked about in the Forsaken, like the Vori Sagon or Sakon.
Vorev Zakonia, like the professional criminal. Well, these guys are professional criminals who decided to trade in, for the professional criminals to serve the state and to pick up a weapon on its behalf was absolutely forbidden. But these guys had, for whatever reason, out of hunger and whatever, decided that they were going to do it. And this was kind of where the Wagner Group got its ideas, because a lot of the camps had emptied out during the war. So I don't know where they got all these guys, but they got them, and they were moving them to the east. And he mentions that he'd heard that they were used as sort of storm troops, and very, very successfully, that they,
It's almost like the French Foreign Legion. I'm assuming those men did a lot of like danger. Like we talked about, like how they would have like some of these men run through like minefields and charge machine gun nests.
So these guys, apparently they used them to sneak up on the Japanese forward positions and kill them with knives and stuff, at night. But
is this in like because there was a thing, you talked about the peace with Japan. There was the battle of the I'm probably pronouncing wrong. The battle of the Kulkin Gol in Mongolia.
Kulkin Gol was
Zhukov.
Zhukov, that was 38.
That was where they made the treaty. Okay, I'm sorry, man.
So this is 7 years later. So this is 7 years later. This is, Stalin's ready to break the treaty and attack. But these two kids basically get like invited into this railroad car full of these convicts.
Hardened men.
And this kid picks up on the fact that these dudes are basically playing cards for his buddy to use him as a catamite. And he kind of nudges his buddy like, "Hey, let's get out of here." His buddy's like, "What do you mean? Like, I'm eating here?" Just sneaks away. He's like, I'm not going to stick around for this.
that's what I wanted to ask you because there is more of this later with Mitya. I might be pronouncing the name wrong, and I'm sorry to keep interjecting. I
No,
just
no.
I don't I know it's a translation, and this is a phenomenal book. It's very short, so I hope that people listening to this read this book because it's not. Baruch mentioned this book to me, and he recommended I read it, and I love reading these memoirs. I'm very fascinated about this time period and this place, and it's very dark. And again, we're going to get into more just sort of like the absolute humanity at its worst. But I was going to ask you, it's almost like they were talking about that he was fat and stuff. And it's like the question I had to you was that were they actually planning on like eating him? Because that's almost what I figured it was a catamite thing. He uses kind of euphemisms for this, but were they talking about eating him or were they just going to like
No.
basically pimp him out and take turns? Because
The
maybe it was the
latter.
second thing. Okay.
The latter,
And
because Soviet troops in the summer of 1945 were not hungry at all.
yeah,
There was plenty of food. Um, there was
and
plenty
it's,
of food, and everybody kind of like in memoirs they like everybody kind of mentions that there was plenty of food to go around by this point
but
for
it's just
troops.
very disturbing. And it's sort of I don't blame him for leaving his friend because it's like if he's not going to listen, but there's a lot of morally ambiguous, and, you know, Kochurgin is not like a coward. Like he does help people. Like there is someone that we're going to talk about next that he does defend. But whenever you read about the gulags or like, if you read about like the Third Reich in the camps, there's always these awful situations where it's like these people are they just see just death around them and just, again, humanity at its lowest. And, Kalima Tales is like this too. I didn't bring this up to like judge Kochurgin. I'm just saying that like I didn't understand if it was the first or the second thing, but it, the Soviet Union during this time, and he travels, he certainly met a lot of people around like you really just see the absolute worst of humanity from the
And the
government
best.
like going downward. And the best, and it's true. There were some genuinely like kind-hearted people that gave him useful skills, including the criminals, by the way. I'm not
Sure.
like but I didn't mean to digress. I
Look,
want thank you
look
for
at it this way.
clarifying that.
This it's 1945, right? So this kid is like maybe 8 years old now,
Yeah.
maybe nine, right? His dad got arrested in 37. He was maybe 1 or 2 years old, maybe 1 year old at that point. So he is a 7 or 8 year old prison escapee. He doesn't have the luxury of, you know, I mean, he's not going to like sacrifice himself for his kid, for his buddy who's busy stuffing his face, while these convict soldiers are, playing cards for his ass.
And think about just
He
how
nudged him in there.
disgusting like
Yeah,
an
these guys.
an 8 year old boy. And that's the first thing. Like if you saw like, I remember one time I was going to a 7-Eleven and there was like just a random kid standing behind the 7-Eleven and I was like sufficiently weirded out. I was in there to get like beer or something. This was like and I talked to the 7-Eleven pro. I was like, there's a kid behind the 7-Eleven, and the person's like, oh yeah, that's fine. Nick, he just waits there. His mom's going to pick him up. But it's like a normal person would just see like two kids and be like, this is weird. Like, why are you not? Russia's not normal in this time period. Like, there's death everywhere. But imagine just seeing a kid and that's by himself that's that age, and the first thing you think of is just like, oh yeah, he's going to make a
Well,
nice lay. And it's just like that's the kind of like mentality with a lot of these people in this country. And it's just like
I
it's
don't
like
think a
in the
lot.
Forsaken, there's a lot of this. There's a lot of this.
I don't think there's a ton of people like when you look at the hundreds of people he describes in this book. There's maybe a handful that are like this,
Well, the
but of
beggars
course,
are like this too, though.
well, the beggars like this. But aside from these convicts and those beggars, there doesn't seem to be a ton of people who are like this. Even the prison guards, some of them are bad. They're evil, they're stupid. They're brutal, but they're not this brutal. So
Yeah.
it's a very brightly written book because he sees everything through the eyes of a child, and because it's kind of almost mythological. And so
Yeah.
the bad is also very very bad. But he survives. He runs away from these guys and he lives on the railroad, and he makes his way by making these profiles of Lenin and Stalin
And
out of
people like
copper.
him. Random
People,
civilians at the rail station are like, this is amazing. And it's like, it's kind of touching in a way that even though you're like, why would you want that? And you're like, if these are the assholes that have ruined,
because this
Lenin
is
and
the
Stalin.
iconography.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like with the saints and stuff, like a lot of Orthodox, in Eastern Europe, like these Orthodox icons and stuff are important, but that's kind of, I guess, the iconography of, but, then he meets Mitya, and I want to just.
Well,
Go ahead.
before we get into Mitai, right? Before we get into
Mitya. Okay, I'm sorry, man.
the world of the railroad in 1945. So 1945, there are masses of people coming back from the war, and masses of cripples, people that have no arms, no legs, they're burn victims, and at every train station, the train stops, and these guys get off, and there's just hordes of women. All the men are gone.
Yeah. Yes.
And the women whose men come back, missing legs, missing arms, or whatever, they're ecstatic to have them back. They're happy because most of their peers don't have a man. He's been killed.
And it's war. Like there's a thing like this guy just has like, I think one arm. I don't remember, like, because there's a lot of this, but she says he'll never run away from me. But yes,
right.
No, he's like a stump. He's like a stump with a head and an arm. And she's like, oh, my sweetheart. And she carries him. It's actually kind of romantic. Like and in some ways it's like kind of touching that you see that she is that happy to see him, because he's not going to be able to work. He's not going to be able to earn a living for. He's not going to be able to. I don't know what he did before the war, but it's actually touching in a way. Yeah, I mean, unless it's like working for the circus. Yeah,
all the other women in the village, their man is gone.
Yeah, so
that's it.
That is actually kind of moving.
They're not going to have another one. That's a whole generation gone. They're going to grow old and die alone, because by the time that the ones who are like 10, 12 years old now, they get old enough to marry him, they're not going to want to marry these women who are 25, 30 now, 35. Yeah. They're going to marry their peers. So there was a whole generation of women, and my grandmother was one of them, that lost her husband at the war and stayed single the rest of her life. And
do you know which battle, if you don't mind me asking, which battle he
was
lost in?
My great well, it was my great grandfather. He was so at the beginning of the war, he was the head engineer in a factory, and he had an exemption for military service in 1941. And he went and somehow got the exemption lifted, volunteered to join the it was called the Opolchenia, which was kind of like the national militia. And he and these guys were very poorly armed and trained. They just got big masses of them and threw them at the Germans. He was in one big encirclement, and in the fall of 41, and he made his way out of there and sent her a letter. And then there was a second big one, I think, at Bryansk, and he just disappeared after that. Which, if he was taken prisoner, they would kill the Jews right away at this point. And I
didn't mean to pry. I'm sorry if I
no.
Not trying to like.
There were many people with stories like this, and so this is the context. So these guys, at every train station, there's kind of a restaurant, and these guys are like eating whatever there is to eat there and drinking beer, and these women are coming up, for the guys that are at that station, and then they take their stumps back home with them, and then the rest of them load up on the train and keep going east. And this guy's going west, and he is bending these profiles out of Lenin and Stalin out of copper wire. People are giving him food, and he's constantly hiding from the cops. Yep. The railroad,
and cops. He hides in very creative ways. Like he'll hide in the strangest places. He he's small, so I think they called him Shadow or something in the
Right.
orphanage. He is a very like lean, thin. I'm sure he's also malnourished, so he's thin, but he can hide in. But he learns the routines of this, so he can hide in like crevices. And he's like, okay, you can't pick the rear car of the train because that's where the cops look first. But he'll hide like at one point later, he hides like with the mortar shells. But he hides in the strangest parts and compartments of the train. Eventually, he gets a key. I'm
Right. He
but
gets a skeleton key. But
yeah.
he meets his best friend this time, and he gets locked up by the railroad cop, who kind of stuffs him in this compartment and goes, okay, you wait here, we'll drop you off with the cops at the next place, you and your little buddy. And there's already a kid in there, and the kid's blind. He lost his eyes
Yes.
in
Can
a
I?
German air raid. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. I want to just emphasize this point because this really um repulsed me in the same way that with the thing with Peter and these like pedophile soldiers that were just gambling. But this guy Mityai, I think he was blind or almost blind, and he had like scars on his face. And I think that I don't remember exactly. Basically, a German shell or something landed near him, and
Yeah. There was an
it
air raid. Yeah.
yeah, or yeah, a bomb. It disfigured his face, and he lost his eyes, and he was just blind. He seems like a kind soul. Like he doesn't understand these giant earth moving events that are happening around him, but he's trying to survive. And these beggars and the beggars, and there's only villains at the government level of this story. It's just always awful. Like everything around is like just pitch black in terms of morality. But these beggars see this kid and they say, wow, this kid's blind. And they're like, you can come stay with us, young man. But then they're talking amongst themselves and they say, well, this blind kid, we can use him to panhandle, but we can also just get even more money if we cut off his right hand. And to me,
He'll be more
just
pitiful.
yeah, exactly. It's like that movie that movie Slumdog Millionaire, where in India, where that guy is blinding the kids and having them sing at intersections, and he's just like this poverty pimp, and they're all taking the panhandling money and giving it to him. He's like a mafia boss, somewhere in India. It's really just vile, like just absolutely disgusting, subhuman behavior. But you know, um, just reading that really kind of like almost chills your blood. Like it's just like you look at someone like a kid who's already gone through that, and you're like, oh yeah, well if he cut off his hand, we can monetize him even more. And it's sort of like with Kalima Tales, where the gangsters in there are just anything like I talked about in The Forsaken how could there even be like this gangster economy? These people have nothing, but they find ways. And there was also Catamites in Kalima. There was a story, I don't remember who told me. Someone I know was was in jail a lot. He's kind of a ne'er-do-well, but he was telling me a story where he was in I think it was like somewhere in jail in New York, and next to his bunk he saw these two people fighting. They were just beating the crap out of each other. And he talks to the guy next to him and he says, why are these guys fighting? Like, what are they fighting about? And the guy said, they're fighting over your shoes. So the implication is like, after they get done fighting, they're going to then beat you up. Whoever wins this fight is going to take your shoes. But that's kind of like, it's just like, it's like a like Russian nesting dolls. Like you have the biggest predation of Stalin and Lenin, and then it's just predation all the way down to like where finally at the bottom it's like, yeah, well, we can cut this kid's hand off and then we can get more money.
Sure.
And it's just it's vile, and it's gross. You need a shower after you read some of it. But Edward actually does protect Milyai. Is that how you pronounce his name?
Mitai.
Mitya, I'm sorry, yeah. But he protects them from these beggars, and he takes the copper wire and he balls it up, and he's like, "Get away from him, you beggars!" And he's like, "I'll shoot you in the eye with this."
With a
And
sling,
it's
right?
kind of
With
yeah,
the
it's kind of
slingshot.
moving that he's actually looks out for this weaker kid who you see glimpses of humanity in there. And I'm sorry for going on this long tangent, but
Well,
I thought that was kind of cool that Edward was like looking after this kid who was clearly also a kind soul. He didn't deserve any of this stuff. And Edward's like trying to look after him, and they're traveling together, and they're both trying to just survive, and they help each other out, and they have each other's backs.
so, there was a book by Victor Hugo called, I think, The Man Who Laughs or The Laughing Man or something like that. And the plot was basically involved a gang of beggars that would kidnap children and deform them in various creative ways to make their
Jesus.
begging more lucrative. And this is, in France, in I think 18th century France, the plot takes place. So this is kind of a constant, unfortunately.
It's a permanent ill of like civilization.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Um, and so right, so they had a joint act. Mitai is also trying to get back to his family in
He could
Western
sing,
Russia.
right?
He would sing a song about Stalin, and then
Yeah.
Edward would simultaneously bend Stalin's
Yep.
profile out of Wired. So all these soldiers and whatever on the train were just like, "Whoa, so cool! Have some food. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love Stalin. You love Stalin? I love Stalin too." Uh, so
Yeah.
so these guys are making their way across, and they have a couple of very interesting encounters, which really I thought were very significant. One was with these Mongolian forest people, because these
Yes.
guys are camping out a little bit. It's the summertime, so the weather's nice, and they run into these two guys who are, I think, from his description, I think they were what's called Urianhai, which is how the Mongolians call the people who live in the forest to the north of Mongolia, right? And
Yeah.
these are forest people, and these guys are living in
With
the
the rope,
wilderness.
where they use the rope as a fire starter.
They use the rope as a fire starter. They tell them, listen, here you camp out where the ants are, like not far from an anthill, because like snakes and all this stuff are afraid of ants. And here's the way you light a fire the most efficient way. And they basically put them through a little like wilderness
Yeah.
survival school. And these guys, what they're doing apparently is they're running hash from southern Central Asia, like I guess the border with Afghanistan, to the great prison camps in the north. And they hang out with these guys, right? And at this point, this is something that you get the death sentence for getting caught. But these guys are such phenomenal. I guess in American terms, they'd be called mountain men. They're so phenomenal
Yeah.
at surviving
Yeah.
in the wilderness. They can cover these great distances and survive and thrive and be fine. And they see these two orphan kids, and they take it upon themselves to give them a few days of lessons.
And they teach them how to make, I think they called it a thief's fire. And it's
Yeah.
also to avoid the authorities, where they taught them how to make a fire with no smoke. And they did not try to bang these boys. They did not do anything creepy. They knew these boys did not have anything to offer, but they did not try to exact like some kind of sexual or awful. So it's like, again, you see the humanity, like it does exist, and there are a lot of good people. They're trapped in this horrific time. I thank God I did not have to live in this area. Just Russia, from like, it's not a place you want to live anywhere there, but there are still just these kind-hearted people that actually do these random acts of kindness. And that's also kind of moving, in my opinion. Like it contrasts with these disgusting, evil beggars. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not saying all the beggars are bad.
How many times survived, right? Like again, this is kind of his constant contrast in this book. The way he survives when he overhears these beggars talking about how they're going to cut his hand off.
And there's a random farmer that shoots his rifle. He's like, "Get away from him, you vermin!"
Well,
and they always
he runs to this guy who's riding a cart down the road at night, and he goes, "Hey, save me from these people."
Yeah.
And these guys are like, "What are you talking about? That's our nephew." And this guy was and this guy's also an amputee. He came back from the front, missing a leg, and he starts like he shoots a shotgun at him and chases him off. So these guys are constantly they're making their way across by their wits, but also by the kindness of strangers.
Yes.
Right.
I mean, just the insults in this book too. And again, if you're listening to this episode, just read this book. There is some very just awful, um, you can see some awful parts of humanity, but you do get these really good insults. And this is also true in the orphanage. Like some of the kindly people will just yell at the guards. And this guy, the amputee you're talking about, I think he called these beggars like outhouse, like vermin. I think they call each other like, just scatological names involving like carrion birds and stuff. Like the insults, and again, it's a translation, but it's really funny. I was laughing at some of the insults. I was like, okay, I could probably use some of these insults in the future, but there are some really funny insults that these Russians and all these different ethnicities call one another. And I had a good laugh at a lot of that.
The language of the book, I mean, the Russian is phenomenally rich. There's really no way to translate most of it adequately. For instance, like the little kids, in the orphanage, they have the medical dispensary, and they call where they go. In the summer when they use these kids for the harvest, and these kids are hungry, so they're just eating vegetables off the field and getting dysentery and getting sick and dying in there and stuff. And they call this place the Mralka, which is actually, I think it sounds very like Sanskrit or whatever. It's from the root word meaning to die. It's like the little dying place. Like
Did you read this one? Did you read this originally? Did you read Christened with Crosses in Russian? Okay, you did.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sure it was a lot better than the translate.
Oh,
again,
it's incredible.
I have no like the translated version that I read is great. I think that I pulled up the Wikipedia page. I think Simon Patterson translated it. Even if you don't speak Russian, the translation is wonderful. But there are a few things where I've asked you about. I was like, what does cybernetics mean? What is this? But this is an impressive translation job. Like I don't want to denigrate Simon Patterson.
How I would do it if I translate this. The only thing I can really compare this book to is Faulkner's As I Lay Dying.
Oh yeah, I've read that one. My Mother is a Fish.
Yeah. My Mother's a Fish. So, like the way like Vardaman or whatever talks in that book, that's kind of, you get a little bit of that here, but well, it's very difficult to bring it across. And the fact is, the story is so rich that the fact that there's like whole levels of the book that are gone in translation, and it's still an incredible book. And just the people that he's meeting. So the next people he meets he calls them Kazakhs. I think they're Kyrgyz, because Kyrgyz and Kazakh were used interchangeably in the Russian Empire, and also in the Soviet Union. Yeah.
As a quick aside, I mean, one of the things that's kind of interesting and maybe frustrating about Russian history when you're trying to like learn about these different populations and stuff is that I talked about how like a lot of these people don't look similar and stuff. There's a lot of just groups that have lived in Russia for a long time. We talked about Themis. We talked about there's the Volga Germans. There are Jewish people. There are the Kalmyks, but there are just all kinds of different random steppe people. There's like Mongolians that have made their way into Russia, which we talked about. But, a lot of ethnic populations, because their loyalty was questioned and stuff, including some of the groups I mentioned before. So they were moved to places like Kazakhstan. I mean, Khrushchev did some harebrained schemes involving agriculture in Kazakhstan, but a lot of Russian populations were just transplanted into these like, I don't know if steppe countries is the right, I guess Central Asia is the term that people use, but a lot of populations, and I'm talking about just huge, like hundreds of thousands of people were moved there. So now, millions. So you have like, I don't know, it's hard to just define. Like, if you're looking at any of these regions, like what is the population that was living there before? What's the one there now?
Oh no,
and
no,
it's
no,
just,
no.
it's very. Oh, go ahead.
It's very clear, but it's very mixed too. This is not something that was unique to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, sure.
Like Sargon, and like the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they all did this too. They would go pick up a group of people from one place and exile them to another, and then move them
Yeah.
around so that everybody was kind of easier to rule because all these groups of people were in places that they weren't really rooted in.
So
Uh,
there's two actually random things, and we're discussing this, but what is that guy's name? William Prescott. He wrote this wonderful, like he wrote about the conquest of Mexico, and he wrote like the conquistadors, Cortez, but he wrote the one about the conquest of Peru. And you have Pizarro. It seems like the people, the conquistadors who were involved in the conquest of Peru were more scoundrels. I don't know if that's true. It seems like he thinks Cortez was certainly had a lot of scoundrel in him, but the guys like Pizarro and his entourage, like those books you can find them on archive and stuff. They're great books. But the Incans would do this, as you're talking about. They would move populations around. The Incans are basically like, it seems like they're the closest to just having a cattle-like civilization, and they would just move people around. Like it seems like they kind of achieved communism before these pesky Europeans showed up. But there's a book I read. There's an Israeli historian, and he's a contrarian, and I really like his books. I've read like 3 of his books. His name is Richard A. Gabriel, and he wrote this book on Alexander the Great where he talks about his alcoholism. I don't know how accurate this is, but his book on Philip II, Alexander's father, and he would fight. It was in Bulgaria. I think they were the Thracians. But Philip II of Macedonia would do these giant population migrations, like they were forcibly done, and he would just settle them in different places. But it reminds me of Stalin and like Khrushchev or whatever. Like, but it's just funny that you brought that up because that guy. But if you're listening to this, like, just Richard A. Gabriel, he's written some crazy stuff about like just cults in Egypt, and he ties into the New Testament. But he's also written about Alexander the Great. He doesn't like Alexander. I think Alexander the Great's cool, but he doesn't like Alexander the Great. But he's written about Philip II, and it's just funny that, and then that William Prescott book. But moving populations, yeah, the Soviets had like railways and stuff, but this is like a very old thing that a lot of all these other empires are like, oh, okay, you're annoying, I'm going to move you over here, and this sort of, I guess, tyranny has like they found various solutions to this stuff in the past, is what I'm saying.
Sure.
I'm sorry to go on a digression, man. I apologize.
So he runs into these guys, these Kazakhs or Kyrgyz, and they're steppe nomad herders, like straight out of like the Middle Ages, like Mongolians. They live in tents. They have herds of horses and sheep and camels. And these guys are also going to the railway. And the reason they're going to the railway is to pick up their kids who are coming back from the front. The Soviet Union sent a lot of Central Asians to the front as they ran out of Russians and Ukrainians to put in the infantry units. And a lot of these guys came back, a lot of them came back dead, obviously, or didn't come back. They would just bury them there. A lot of them came back wounded. A lot of them came back with, and these are Muslim populations, they came back with alcoholism problems because you would get vodka, you'd get 100 grams a day at the front.
Yeah.
That's for every guy that was alive. So usually what they would do is they would draw their vodka. Well, they would draw their vodka ration before they would go on the attack, and then they would split it between whoever survived. So you get more than 100 grams, sometimes a lot more. And and that's, you think about 100 grams a day for somebody that, weighs, 130 pounds soaking wet. A lot of these guys aren't big people, over months and months and months. Right. So these guys come back and they're picking up their kids, and they're like putting them on these like magnificent stallions, and these guys like, are missing legs or arms or whatever. And they're just like, they're proud that their kid, served in the war and, fought and survived and so on. And they adopt these kids and they say, you guys should stay with us. Your buddy's got lung problems, I guess. Tuberculosis.
They
we
did
can
some
treat him.
lambskin. They gave him some lambskin stuff.
And these guys go, no, we got to make it back to our family. And they make their way to the Urals, they get adopted by an artillery unit, which basically chases the cops off. I mean, these guys don't like the cops either. The soldiers and the officers don't like the cops, and
The cops are
you can
probably some
imagine.
of the people that were like just forcibly conscripting their relatives in this meat
Well,
grinder
just
war.
just the fact that these guys are coming back from the front, and these assholes were riding the rail, while these dudes were going through the grinder. They don't like the cops. They got these like orphan kids that they kind of adopted. They can sing songs about Stalin, make profiles at him out of wire, and they ask the cops, oh yeah, like, oh, you don't like him making pictures of Stalin? Maybe you don't like Stalin. The cops are like, no, 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 no,
Yeah,
no,
yeah.
no. We'll
There's a
leave now.
couple times where they do that. Yeah, like yeah.
And they turn themselves in to the Urals, which is like west of Siberia. They make it to
Yeah.
Chelyabinsk, and they hand themselves into the local orphanage because it's getting cold
Yes.
now, right? I mean, they
And
only
it
have a
just
window of a few months a year to travel,
and it just
right?
as an aside, all right. So I I know I've been saying that I'm sure it's irritating for you and your like listeners when I say like the Urals or whatever. Like, how would you pronounce it? Urals?
You could say Urals, yeah,
Ural.
yeah.
Okay. But when you think about the Soviet Union, like for instance, just communism in general, like the record keeping, like you've obviously heard about like in East Germany when the Stasi um and that government like Milken or whatever, Honecker that fell, they found like literally like just miles, like I think it was like just I don't even remember how they classified, but this is before this is like pre-internet, but they had like 32 miles of just papers, like just single sheets of paper stacked. They are very good at paperwork, and they make files on everyone. That's what you think. I mean, that's just German fastidiousness. But when you think about the Soviet Union, all the files, like if you've read Lenin's Tomb, which is a great book written by kind of a blue-pilled guy, but it's a great book, and it talks about these people that were in the Soviet archives. And kind of like our first episode when we talked about the person who found just all this creepy stuff involving the minutes of some of these foundations, like the Rockefeller, the Carnegie stuff, and it was all there. But the Soviets were really good. They had huge archives of all this stuff, like just metric tons of just paper, and just the Stasi did. And the Soviet Union also kept the stuff. And again, Lenin's Tomb talks about all these records, but they kept all these records. But then you read about like this book, and what I thought was weird about it, and it's something you kind of alluded to in the beginning of this episode when you were doing the introduction, is that like these random kids are riding the rails, and when they go to some other NKVD orphanage or whatever, they don't contact the previous orphanage. It's like, okay, we'll take them. We're not going to try to find. It'd be like if I was a fugitive, like let's say I committed a crime in Minnesota or something, and then I escaped from jail, and then I went to Arizona. If the cops arrested me today, I suspect what they would do is they would look to see if there were any open warrants out for me by my name, and then they would say, oh, okay, this Minnesota correctional facility is missing me, so I'm going to contact them, and I'm going to send this character back. But that's
Well,
not what happens in this book. These kids
even
get,
even in the U.S., it's not necessarily what happens, right?
yeah,
Because let's say you get you rob somebody in Minnesota, and you get 3 years or whatever, and then you run away, and you get
yeah,
arrested in Arizona for committing another crime, and you're doing your 3 year sentence in Arizona, and they let Minnesota know, like they let Minnesota know. Minnesota might go, well, whatever, and you know they might not send a couple of cops all the way down there to come get you and whatever. You're already doing time. It's not really their problem. They don't want you. You're a pain in the
yeah.
ass, and so it kind of works like that today. Also, a little bit.
But it's just weird. Like, okay, so you obviously heard of like, various states have like just alerts if a child is missing, or even if, say,
Sure.
like a lot of kidnapping cases are just a divorce situation where there is split custody, and the husband or the wife or whatever is like, no, I'm not. I want these are my kids, and they'll just take them and they'll go somewhere else. They're not. It's not like some freak in a white pedophile van grab the kids and it's like a custody situation.
Sure.
But nonetheless, in these states, you will still get alerts that this
Now,
child is missing and this is that. But it's just funny in the
but not
Soviet
in
Union, which
1947.
yeah, in the police state of the Soviet Union, Stalin state, where your neighbors, you can cough wrong and there'll be a file on you and then you'll get a knock on your door. It's just funny. These kids are traveling around this huge country and the
Sure.
orphanage is like, okay, all right, two more, we'll take them. And they don't bother, they don't know the backstory for them. And that was something that also struck me because if the communists, I don't like communists are very meticulous record keepers,
You
whether
would
they
think
are,
so.
yeah. But I thought
But
that was
but
just an
but
interesting
but
aside.
well, yeah, and it's always amazing how in all these systems where supposedly it's all like orderly, there's so many cracks and stuff can fall through.
Yes.
And this happens, in the prison system. This happens in the military, in America,
Yeah.
and of course it happened there. So they hand themselves in. This Mitai kid has tuberculosis apparently.
Yes.
They split him up. They send him to a special orphanage for the blind kids, and
Yeah.
then his condition gets worse, and he dies,
Yes.
which is very kind of like a heartbreaking scene. Um,
And it
and
seems
then
like the guy Edward actually did like that was his best friend ever. Like he really was
oh,
just
he was
just
heartbroken.
devastated. And he really like he went through it. Like the way you make friends is you bond through going through terrible stuff. Like I mean, that's why I like military friends. I've never been in the military, but military friendships, you go through hell together and it like any kind of adversity suffered together and my goodness, did they go through adversity. And then his friend, who probably was one of the few people that understood him on a personal level like that, like he's just gone. And now he's in this disgusting orphanage. And it's just like, I can't imagine how that feels.
Right. But this orphanage is a little better than the other one because the people that are in charge of them, I mean, they're still kind of orcs, but at least they've been to war.
Yeah.
They've been to the front, and it's kind of made them somehow like more sympathetic. Um, but there are kids that are in this orphanage that get treated much worse than others. They get less food, and these are the Russian German kids. So all
Yeah.
these Povolzhia Germans who'd been in
Yes.
Russia for like 200 years, they've been invited by Catherine the Great or whatever, come settle here and grow crops. You guys know how to grow food. These guys all of a sudden they're an enemy of the people, and the adults I guess got sent one way and the kids got sent another way, and these kids are just getting treated like garbage for being
Well,
Germans.
okay. So how did you say it? Volga?
Volga.
Oh, Volga. Okay. That's how I said it. I've
Yeah.
been pronouncing all this stuff wrong.
But no, Povolzhia is like the area around the Volga, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but there was a scene in that memoir where, and it sort of it ties back to the beginning where these groups don't like each other. Like there was a scene where, someone wanted to beat up, Kochurgin because he was doing the religious, like I think he was doing, the cross, and they were like, no, that's how Catholics do it. It's fine. He's Russian. The guy's like, well, I still want to beat him up, but they thought that these Germans were fascist, and there was a rumor going around in the orphanage, and the orphans were just they'd lathered themselves up into this just white hot hatred of these new arrivals. And then someone was like, well, wait, how come they speak Russian though? They must have lived here a long time. And they're like, okay, maybe we shouldn't beat them up. Eventually, these kids, I think, went to a different orphanage. But it's just funny because they're just like, we're gonna just mash them. And then it's like, well, how do these fascist enemies of Russia just speak Russian really well? And I thought that was a funny anecdote, I guess. I don't know.
So the interesting thing about these Germans is that a lot of them in the 90s got sent back to Germany, where their ancestors had come from hundreds of years before. And by the way, a lot of the Greeks, the Pontic Greeks,
Yeah.
who were in Russia's Black Sea area, also went back to Greece, where I mean, I think the Pontic Greeks, their last ancestors had been in Greece, maybe like 3,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago. But
Yeah.
they were happy to get out of the Soviet Union. And in Germany, I mean, I met some of them because they stole something out of my buddy's car and I had to
Really?
go into their projects and talk to like the head one who had gold teeth and be like, listen, like we want this guy's car stereo back, please. We
He
don't want to
stole a
like
stereo out?
these kids stole my buddy's thing, and I said, listen, this guy's a special forces guy. We don't want like there to be a big international incident. This guy was like, all right, he called up his, like little cousins or whatever, and he gave us. So these
So they're
guys
like
were basically
gypsies at this point.
they were complete hood rats. But in Russia, these guys at this point, they were known in the early 20th century, and they were known for being incredibly productive, incredibly orderly, and like you would go to like one of these German villages, and they would be like incredible, like how much better they would be at everything than the Russians, you know. So I guess getting sent to Central Asia, and I knew guys like this personally, aside from Germany, it really dislocated and criminalized a lot of them. Um, so this guy escapes again the next summer, obviously.
Yeah.
And he's traveling the Urals, and he's like, man, these people just suck. They're mean, they're greedy, they're inhospitable. The way they build their houses, there's like a tall wall around every house. And he gets adopted by a Chinese guy, a Chinese artist.
Yeah, and he does the paint. He does the more card painting, and the guy shows him some techniques. And that Chinese guy and his wife are very kind to him. So that's another
Yes.
example.
But
And
the Chinese guy married a Russian girl. Who's like the Chinese widow, she'd married a Chinese guy. That guy died. She's like, well, I'm not going to marry another like a Russian. I got to go find another Chinese guy. And this guy's a professional artist. He's a painter. He sells his paintings at the bazaar, and he sees this kid that he knows how to draw cards and stuff, and he basically takes him on as an apprentice.
Can we just do another tie-in for a second? Because I like the fact that we've done these episodes, and again, I know the first one was just sort of like I was just bringing stuff up all over from the past, but I like the idea of every episode. So in The Forsaken, we tie it into stuff we discussed in the first episode, but in this episode, which covers the same time period as The Forsaken, in The Forsaken, we had and I think it's important for people to know this stuff, but just again, there are after World War II, there are just Japanese people that are in the USSR. There are American POWs that are in the USSR, and they stayed there for a lot longer and they intermixed. But it's not that weird. And there's probably from the Vietnam War. We talked about H. Bruce Franklin, the just irritating liberal person. But these people ended up like Russia was just this giant magnet because of all these conflicts that surrounded it. And all these people from different nationalities, whether they're Americans, whether they're Germans, whether they're Japanese, and whether they are, Chinese people or whatever, they end up in Russia, and some of them end up staying there. So you get this very fascinating hodgepodge of different people that are foreigners, but just for whatever reasons, they just stay there. And you see them when you read about like these memoirs from this time period. And I think that's also fascinating. Russia, like it's just a dark time, but I've always loved reading about just these Russian memoirs from all these time periods, because you see so many different people from all over the world, and they just end up in these random cities in Russia. And these foreigners interact with each other. And that's one of the things that I thought was most fascinating about that Forsaken book that you recommended. That was a great recommendation.
You can still
there's a Chinese guy living there.
If you go to Russia today, you can see, in every big Russian city, you can see a tremendous mix of ethnicities. And some of them just got there, 5 years ago, and some of them have been there for hundreds of years. And Russia has a huge border with China, obviously. People have been going back and forth across the border. And this guy's an artist. He came there, I guess, from the 20s or 30s. They had a whole thing with the railway there. and he's painting stuff, and the Kuchergin mentions that this guy painted a mural of Stalin or whatever, and Stalin looks suspiciously like the Tatar director of the bazaar, right? the guy that ran the bazaar. This dude was like, "Hey, go sit down over there. You're going to be Stalin." So, so, and then this guy, he goes and gets cold again, turns himself in again, and he meets another guy that's fascinating. He meets this guy who's an Estonian who always wears turtlenecks.
And he ends up in the Baltic later. Like Kuchergin ends up in the Baltics later on. Yeah.
Yes. This is kind of a little bit of foreshadowing, but this Estonian guy, he sees them in the bathhouse, and this dude is covered in like Japanese tattoos.
Yes. Yeah. And he lost a bet. He actually had to give up his food because he's like, I don't believe that guy is covered in tattoos. He's almost got the Yakuza tattoos. And then they saw the guy, and then they're like, you owe us some food. But yeah, he's covered completely in these beautiful tattoos. And people would come up to him and look at his tattoos because like the Japanese tattooist, or I think, it was it was Japan that tattooed this stuff. It wasn't the Chinese, right?
Right. It was. So this guy was a POW in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. And
just like the Forsaken.
Big, like pale-skinned Estonian dude, right? And these guys show up to the prison camp, and they make a deal with the director of the prison camp, and they make these guys strip, and then they look at this guy. They're like, okay, here's the deal. Like, we have final exams coming up. Our guys need to do their final exams on somebody. If you don't mind, we'll do our final exams on you, and then we'll let you go. And he goes, okay, sure. And so he spends like months getting tattooed by these guys who spent, I don't know, 5 years or 10 years or whatever, learning how to tattoo, and he says it's incredible, like it doesn't hurt. And then he's covered in tattoos, and they're like, okay, well, back to Russia you go, right? And then this guy teaches Kuchergin how to tattoo people the Japanese way, which I guess is like he said, like it doesn't hurt. It's like acupuncture and all this other stuff. So
and he did it for the criminals after that,
right? So not only does this guy know how to draw cards, but he also knows how to tattoo people, and it's incredible. He's got like the full suite, except for the one thing, which he learns next because he runs away from this orphanage. He starts heading across the railroad. By this point, the narrative is very compressed because I guess he's kind of, first of all, he's gotten older, so everything's not so bright anymore, so much larger in life. And second of all, a lot of the stuff he's already told, he's kind of already told you how it was. And so by this point, it's probably like 1948, 1949, and he gets adopted by professional railroad thieves.
And they went through like a criminal boot camp where they're like slapping. They're like, we're going to beat you. It's to toughen you up. And then we're going to teach you how to do a somersault. We're going to teach you how to pickpocket someone without feeling. They gave him the works. And like,
he goes through ninja school. And these guys.
Yeah, exactly. They beat the shit out of him at first. And then they're like,
yeah.
But then, they teach him all the stuff. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I apologize.
Well, the Russian thieves had specializations. So a guy whose specialty was to pickpocket people so they wouldn't feel it, that's all he'd do. And there was a guy who'd be a safe cracker, and there'd be guys whose job would be to rob apartments. And these guys, their job was to rob trains. Yeah. And they were like acrobats because you have to be able to jump off trains. You have to be able to run across the top of the trains, break into railroad cars, steal luggage, how to sell to fences, and it was all like clockwork, working as a team. And they took this guy and they said, okay, you can run across the top of compartments better, because you're little. And so he spent several months with these guys.
Yeah.
Right?
And they actually do. I mean, they were hard on him. I don't think they did it out of sadism. I think from their perspective, they're like, we're trying to teach you. It's like, this is like a apprenticeship or whatever. We're trying to show you what we do. Like, they didn't do it just to be mean. And I think that they did it because they actually did respect his abilities. And I'm not even getting into the morality of this. I'm just saying that's from their worldview. That's why they did this stuff.
Oh yeah, of course. Well,
he became a member of them.
think about the stakes. I mean, you get
Yeah,
caught. At the very least, you're going to a prison camp.
sure.
These guys might beat you to death too. These are
Yeah,
not these are not like these are not these are people who spent the last few years going through some very hard stuff. you
yes.
know, they might not take kindly to you stealing their luggage. They might just beat you down and throw you off the train and kill you. you know,
Yeah.
so
Can
so
you still hear me okay? Like
yeah,
I
yeah,
got my microphone up. Okay, you can still hear me. Okay.
yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, it is weird though because this kid, it's like he's gone through puberty recently. But the stuff that he's been through, this is like the stuff that many grown men don't go through. Like
Oh yeah,
he's tough, and I mean, the people he encounters are also hardened, but he is a very tough young man, and um, his resiliency and just the stuff that he learned, and I think to his credit, he was a quick learner and stuff but he was very like adept at just like adapting to this insane, cutthroat, brutal Slavic environment, I guess is what I would say.
yeah. Well, he was very talented,
Yes,
and
he
he
had.
was he was very, very, very clever, and
It's
yeah,
like Herman and Segovia. Like they also had their own inherent talents, and they were also, I would say, just they were very tough men. I mean, whatever else, like you can't take that away from them. Like Victor Herman was tough. Like before he went to the gulag, he was jumping out of planes. Like this is a very formidable man.
sure, sure. Um, yeah, and this whole thing would make a great movie, because it's
Yeah,
got an incredible story arc. And so he gets away from these professional thieves eventually because he knows like there's no future in it. And also one of them starts kind of macking on him, and he doesn't like that at all. And he overwinters again in an orphanage, and then
yeah.
escapes with
Well,
a friend of his to the Russian far north, right?
well, is the orphanage? And I'm gonna like. I know he was in multiple ones. Is the timeline of this point? Is this the one that was in the Baltics? Is this the one that was in Estonia near
Not
the
yet, not yet. This
Latvia?
is
Okay,
in a place called Kirov.
okay, all right, all right.
So Kirov is like in the European part of Russia, ready? And he
Yes,
escapes with his friend to the Russian far north, which is like Arkhangelsk and everything else. And this place is a little bit like it's a special place. And you can see he's really impressed with like the Russian Northerners. He says that they're much kinder, even though the land is very much harder. The climate is very much harsher, but they're much kinder than the people in the Urals. And he stays with some old people there and kind of writes down how they talk. And this lady who's a little bit of a kind of a folk healer slash witch slash whatever. Um, and she's she has a very special way of talking, which is very funny. But one of the stories she tells him is that there was a soldier passing through that got 3 girls pregnant, and he kept going. And the rest of the girls there, they envied the ones that got pregnant
wow.
because again, all the men were dead. You
Can
know,
can I just do a random book recommendation that kind of ties in with this that I really enjoyed? So I've read quite a few Stalin biographies, and obviously the Robert Conquest one is the best one to start with, but there's many other. The Robert Service one's good. The Simon Sebag Montefiore one, I did a thread on this. I read that biography, I don't know, several months ago, and I wish I'd read it earlier. Really great book, but that same author wrote a biography on the young Stalin, which was Stalin, up until the Russian Revolution. And it just talks about all of his like weird, organized crime, gangster, Bolshevik activities. But it's just a fascinating book. It talks about like, that guy, KMO, who was just this total freak. He was sort of like the, Herman Marx. I think we talked about him in the Cuba thing in the first episode we did, that weirdo who just went on, and even the Cubans were like, dude, you're too bloodthirsty. The guy who was doing the executions. But this guy, Camo, is like that. A lot of people, but Stalin kept getting sent. The Tsar was very lenient because when the Tsar would send people to Siberia, you could escape easily. Maybe not so much Siberia, but I think Stalin escaped like 6 times. It's not like the Gulag. It's whatever the flaws of Nicholas II and the Romanovs, and there were many, too many to count, they were not these just evil Gulag sadists the way the Bolsheviks were. But Stalin ended up in this random village. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because this happened a lot where these revolutionary types, and they were very sexy to locals. It's sort of like how if you look at like the Weathermen, like
right.
Bill Ayers and stuff, all the girls wanted, but like these revolutionaries would get sent to these Gulag villages, and it ties into what you're talking about because Stalin was in some Siberian village and he impregnated some 14-year-old girl in this random village that's nowhere near, and I think their brothers wanted to kill him. He somehow got out of this. But he did impregnate her, and it was like if you were a refugee, or not a refugee, if you were a political prisoner in these villages, that was a very, I guess, impressive, high status thing to the locals. I mean, at least to the women. The brothers aren't going to like you. The fathers are probably going to like, what are your intentions with my daughter? But he did knock up this 14-year-old girl there. And she cared about him. And then his son got raised there. He didn't do anything for his son. And he just left.
This Stalin guy might have been problematic.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't read enough about him. He doesn't seem like such a good guy. He seems like kind of a not good person.
Stalin is canceled. The problematic age gap relationship.
But it reminds me, and it's not the only one of those yet, but it just reminds me.
Maybe he was a libertarian.
About. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, he would. Well, that's true.
At this point, this was at the libertarian stage of Stalin's. Stalin was a redditor.
Yeah, but it's just weird because it's tying into what you're saying. But again, it's weird because you think these local girls are like, there's no future here because the Tsar would never sentence people to life there. They'd get like 6 years, maybe at most. That would be the most draconian thing. Then they'd leave. So it's like, but they don't. It doesn't translate that way. And again, he did have a son there. This son grew up. This woman, this is common knowledge. But if you want to read a funny book and you can learn all these weird things about the Russian Empire and the provinces and young Stalin, and it's very entertaining. I mean, he was basically a gangster, and a very vicious one. You should read Simon Sebag Montefiore's. I'm probably saying his name wrong too. Young Stalin. Because it talks about it, but it just ties into what you're saying. And I wanted to share that because there's just so many weird things about Russia that just like, I realize, I guess I've lived in America my whole life, and I guess that does make me parochial, but I love reading all these different books and memoirs about Russia because there's so much cool stuff. And I guess by cool, I mean awful, but you just get the full spectrum of human experience in this fascinating country and its provinces and stuff. And I didn't mean to digress. I just wanted to share that, but it tied into what you're saying.
I'm starting to think that Stalin perhaps was a Mexican criminal, between the bank robbery and getting a 14-year-old pregnant, and also of course the mustache. I think Stalin would have fit in fine in East LA,
Yeah. A cholo
Stalin.
Yeah.
The truth comes to light.
He's got an El Camino.
Stalin has Stalin with a lowrider. Yes. Cool. Okay. So this guy makes his way back to the railroad again. He gets adopted by thieves again, heads for Leningrad, misses Leningrad, overshoots. And
he was doing the ink. He was doing the ink for them at this point. He was inking them, and that also gained him immediate respect because, it's going on your body permanently. But if someone can do tattoos well, that's like an immediate thing that's just going to give you status in any of these criminal groups.
Note to all the listeners: if you're considering a career that's going to require you spending time in jail, you might want to have a tattoo. So
yeah.
So he overshoots Leningrad and he goes to Estonia, which is as far west at this point as you can go, and still in the Soviet Union. gets stuck in the orphanage there, tries to escape, gets caught.
He hates that one. He said that one was really nasty.
Yeah. Well, because it's Estonians. The Estonians were kind of assholes to him.
Is that okay? As
well,
someone who's oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I've never met the Estonians. Actually, it's not true. When I was a little kid, we spent a little bit of time there, and I remember getting to fight them. But they have a reputation for being they have a reputation for being kind of like these cold people that everything's got to be super orderly. If there's a pattern in this book, is that until now everything has been not super orderly.
Yeah, and no kidding.
they did not like Russians or anything that seemed like Russians or anything that was not, at least people from the Baltics, if not preferably Estonians. And this guy was, Russian/Polish. They probably just saw him as Russian, and they turned him in. And this orphanage was in some big estate that had been
wasn't it near Latvia, the Latvian border? I'd have to look at the Baltic map.
Yeah, exactly. It was near a city that, like, the border between Latvia and Estonia runs through it, and they tried to escape and screwed it up and got caught on the Estonian side of the border. And whatever the lady that was running the orphanage, like, I told you I was going to send you to jail, and he goes to jail.
But then they let him out. They're like, there's some training program thing that you can do.
Right. He's 16 now, so he's trying to go, like, they have some kind of vocational training for sailors, and that, he's like, okay, I'll go be a sailor, and that doesn't work out. And then he gets a call, and they go, hey, come here, you get over here. This is your name. Yeah, that's my name. All right, here, go take him. Gets sent on a train back to Leningrad under escort to the NKVD headquarters, and his mom's there. His mom did her 15 years, right? It's 1952. She did 15 years.
It's a surreal part of the book because it seems like it seems like he's almost dreaming because he doesn't even know how to react, and she probably doesn't fully recognize him, and it's very moving. And then she takes him home, but then at the last pages, he has this nightmare. And at first I read it, I was like, "Are you kidding me?" Because that's not something they're above doing. Do they pull the rug out and just put him back in the gulag? Because in the Forsaken episode, we talked about this too. A lot of these people that got freed, he wasn't a gulag prisoner, nor was she, but that's something that this government was certainly capable. Well, yeah, she was, but he was an orphan technically. But yeah, they could have pulled the rug out. But he just has this almost like PTSD event where he has a nightmare and he thinks he's back. Like it's horrific. And I had to reread it a few times because I was like, okay, he's just dreaming this. But in the Kalima Tales book, Vladimir Shalamov at the end of the book he would have nightmares from the gulag. I need to reread Kalima Tales. I still haven't read his one. He talks about the Russian mafia and the gulags. I have it. I haven't read it yet. But he says that I think he was in there for 17 years, but he says like he woke up in a cold sweat he would have. And I think what freaked him out is like, I was in here for this long, but he talks about man's terrible ability to forget. So in other words, he's like, this could just be moved past. And he doesn't want to just dwell on it the rest of his life, but he also doesn't want to just, let's just concrete over. It's sort of like that thing in, I don't know if you've watched the movie, you've probably seen Gangs of New York. I think it's a very moving ending where the guy who kills, Bill the Butcher kills Liam Neeson in the beginning of the movie. And he was a native. He was like a know-nothing. That's not what they call it in the movie, but he's buried next to, Lee, exactly. And they bury them side by side. And then there's that, I hate U2's music, but the instrumental version of The Hands That Built America, there's this thing at the end where Leonardo DiCaprio does this, narration where he says, it was like we never existed at all. And then it just shows the time lapse of, there's I don't know if it's the East River. I don't know which one it is in New York, but you see the city skyline getting built up through the Gilded Age and et cetera. And then it shows the grave side by side getting like the grass is growing, and eventually the tombstones get, there's probably a parking lot there today. Like it's a fictional site, but that's sort of like, it's like they didn't exist is what he's saying, because they're not politicians. There were these random gang leaders. There were the underworld people, but that's kind of like what Shalamov seems to be kind of alluding to in terms of at the end of Kalima Tales, where he's like, it freaks him out that he went through all this stuff and that it could just be forgotten. It could just be like asphalted over, if that makes sense. And that's kind of how it feels at the end of this memoir, where he's reliving this stuff and then he wakes up and it's just, I don't know. That's how I viewed it. Like, it freaked me out a little bit, though.
It's really amazing. It's an amazing scene where they get pulled into the NKVD headquarters, right? And there's a captain there who's, I guess, just the guy on duty. He's a relatively young guy, and he tells him, "Listen, don't tell anybody what you've seen. Where you've been." And his mother tells him, "Don't tell anybody, because in this country it's easier to plant a person than a tree."
Yes,
right. And it's really kind of a surreal that at the end of this kind of it's sort of an odyssey, to be honest. Like it is really an odyssey.
It's like Odysseus took 20 years to get home, and then it's almost like I'm not like Penelope waited for him, but it's like, I'm not saying that he was like had the relationship. I'm not doing an incestuous thing, but it's like his mom didn't forget him and he didn't forget his mom, and that is actually moving. That whatever these giant gears grinding, he was trying to get to Leningrad, and he was willing to deal with all of these underworld people and just these disgusting, sadistic guards in the orphanage and these railway cops. And he did manage to like reunite with his mother, and that is kind of heroic in a way. In fact, it's not kind of, it is heroic.
It really is. It's a heroic odyssey. That's a big aspect of it. I mean, think about all the times that he could have ended up, he could have gone with the forest people. I don't know if they would have taken it. He could have gone with the nomads. He could have gone with the professional criminals and stayed in that world. Certainly lots of opportunities, and he didn't. He kept going.
You're breaking up a little bit. I'm sorry, man. I can hear you. I don't want to ruin your recording.
Sure.
Okay, I can hear you perfectly now.
Sure. So there were a lot of points where he could have kind of gotten off the journey, and he didn't. Kept chugging away, and he had divine providence. God saved him and saved his mother and reunited him. Now he had a younger brother who I guess went insane when he was little, from being taken away from his family, and died in an orphanage very, very quickly. So there were so many parts of the story where this guy obviously easily could have died, or something else could have happened, and obviously we wouldn't have had this story. But I just thought it was an incredible story on so many levels.
Yes,
historically and ethnographically, and just as a narrative, as a tale. We discuss a bunch of kind of grim prison memoirs and so on and so forth, but there were 100-something million people in Russia. They weren't all, they weren't all one thing. Their lives weren't all one thing. And I really thought that this was a fascinating.
It's like they managed to hustle, and they managed to just like claw their way into dignity a lot of the time, and they did not just give up. And they also managed to, they had enough like dignity to spare where they had like a surplus of goodness, and they could transfer, those people, when the forest people that we talked about, they left those two young boys, including the blind one, they left them a section of rope so they could remake the fires. They're like, we're going to show you this stuff. These are poor people. They're not like they're not like, they didn't like roll up to these boys in the woods and they're like, an escalator or something, but they left a section of rope and they helped. They're like, all right, maybe it's like you're going to encounter some young travelers and you can pass this information onward. But it is. I don't have any idea of like that kind of desperation, but um, it is neat that these people, like, there are some just absolutely like abysmal, like awful human beings in this book, just the lowest of the low. Even the soft white underbelly guy, like, would probably interview and be like, all right, get the hell out of here. You're just disgusting. Like, and that guy interviews some really nasty people, but even he's like, all right, you want to cut his right hand off. All right, why don't you get out of my studio now, you scumbag? And he turns into and then he votes for Nixon after that. But like, okay, there's those people, but then there's the people that are just brutally poor, but they still do try to help out other poor people. And I thought that was kind of also very just moving reading this book. And it is just a fascinating memoir because this kid literally traveled like all of Russia. This is like 6 time zones. And he saw the best of humanity and the worst of humanity. And he is just, I'm sure that, like, I don't know. I mean, it fundamentally changed who he was as a man. Like, and even if he wasn't an adult, he certainly was a man by the end of that memoir. Like, he'd seen it all. Like, I don't know, but it was a really great book recommendation. I really appreciate you recommending this book. I know some of the stuff you mentioned in the Forsaken in the first episode we did sounded like these wonderful books. And you were talking about the AI translating this stuff, but I don't speak Russian, or I can't read the Cyrillic alphabet, but I do appreciate you recommending this book because I did enjoy it quite a bit. And I learned a lot about Russia during this time, and I saw a lot of different parts of it that I would not have seen had I not read Kochurgin's book.
Right. Okay. So I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. I want to thank our listeners who've stuck with us this long. We will try to have another good book to review for next time.
Yeah, and thank you for inviting me back on your show. I've always enjoyed discussing these books with you and just shooting the breeze, but I feel like we've always found really interesting books. There's so much stuff out there. Like, if you're interested in this time period, you could do a lot worse than reading Christened with Crosses or reading Shalamov or any of these books, or just, maybe just pick a random book on the Soviet Union during this time and just look at some of the sources. A lot of these books, like The Forsaken, has a lot of, pretty much any book on Stalin's Russia is going to have some amazing primary sources. And I don't know, maybe just try picking one of them out and reading it. I'm sure that you will find other amazing stuff from doing even this kind of investigation. That's how I find a bunch of good stuff. I just read old books and see what they reference. And then, but there's just an ocean of these amazing memoirs out there, like on the USSR. And I think it's important to remember this stuff and to try to understand what it was like during this time period. And I think it ties into the whole 20th century. So, but thank you for having me on your show, Baruch. I really always appreciate it when you invite me on.
Okay, Mr. Dictator's Den, thank you for coming on.